The title of today's task force hearing is Preventing Cultural Genocide, Countering the Plunder and Sale of Priceless Cultural Antiquities by ISIS. We now welcome our witnesses. Mr. Robert Edsel is our first witness today. Mr. Edsel is the author of several nonfiction books, including Rescuing Da Vinci, The Monuments Men, Allied Heroes, Nazi Thieves, and the Greatest Treasury Hunt in History, as well as Saving Italy, The Race to Rescue a Nation's Treasure from the Nazis. He's co-producer of the documentary film, The Rape of Europa, and the founder and president of Monuments Men Foundation for the Preservation of Art. Most famously, Academy Award winner George Clooney directed and starred in a film based on Mr. Edsel's book, The Monuments Men, which was released on February 7, 2014. Raised in Dallas, Texas, Mr. Edsel graduated from St. Mark's School of Texas and Southern Methodist University. He's been awarded the Texas Medal of Arts Award, the President's Call to Service Award, Hope for Humanity Award, presented by the Dallas Holocaust Museum. In 2014, he was presented with the Records of Achievement Award from the Foundation for the National Archives, which recognizes an individual whose work has fostered a broader national awareness of the history and identity of the United States through the use of original records. He serves as trustee of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And with that, Mr. Edsel, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you, sir.
I'd like to extend my thanks to Chairman Fitzpatrick, Ranking Member Lynch, and the members and staff of the task force for including me in these important deliberations. Evidence that ISIS has sanctioned the looting and sale of antiquities to generate revenue for terrorism is a game changer. It compels us to think about the ownership of art, the responsibility of the art trade and collectors, and the role of the federal government differently than ever before. We cannot say we weren't warned. As recently as 1981, Monuments man Mason Hammond, the only monuments officer to see duty in Italy and Germany, and an important advisor to General Eisenhower's staff, urged all those willing to listen, quote, "Planners for future hostilities tend to think in terms of the last conflict, but any consideration of the different ways in which the First and Second World Wars were fought demonstrates the fallacy of such an approach. If this generation wishes to leave to its children the cultural treasures that it has enjoyed, such planning should be encouraged." Hammond's warning went unheeded, but as events in Iraq in 2003 and more recently in Syria have painfully demonstrated, he was right. The Monuments Men saw firsthand that the destruction of cherished artistic and religious treasures is the starter gun that precedes genocide and the human suffering that follows. It proved true in Nazi Germany, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in al-Qaeda-controlled areas of Afghanistan and Mali, and now in ISIS-administered portions of Syria and Iraq. Ignoring this early warning sign denies our nation the chance to act. We can only react. Organizations that are charged with preserving our cultural heritage are instead relegated to bearing witness to its destruction. Steps we as a nation have taken to protect our homeland following September 11th have not kept pace with developments in the art world, nowhere near. Today, art is synonymous with money. The global explosion of wealth these past 20 years has created more buyers with greater resources chasing prized objects. Prices have skyrocketed. Consider that a painting by Picasso that sold for less than $200,000 in 1956 recently sold for $180 million, a sculpture by Giacometti for $141 million, a drawing by Raphael for $50 million. The sums are staggering, and yet regulatory authorities have not created and applied the same level of control procedures in the art market as we have in other areas of commerce involving similar sums of money. This creates a weakness that ISIS and others, tax cheats, those in possession of looted paintings and objects, and smugglers can exploit. The very profitability of art and antiques, and sometimes their relatively small size, facilitates movement, sometimes into hiding places out of view by tax authorities, Nazi-looted claimants, and other victims of theft. For example, just last week, the Panama Papers leak revealed that a Nazi-looted painting by Modigliani, worth upwards of $25 million, was among thousands of works of art stored in special tax zones known as free ports. While this art netherworld does provide privacy for the honest, the lack of transparency also cloaks tax cheats, thieves, and those aiding ISIS's business operation of converting cultural treasures to cash to fund terrorism. The art trade is a largely self-regulated, antiquated business model operating in a digitized, near invisible world. Until the advent of the internet in the late 1990s, few in the art world paid attention to provenance, a fancy word for who owned something in the past, unless it enhanced the value of the object. Looted art traded hands, some of it openly. Although there has been improvement in the scrutiny of objects sold at public auction, there remains a high degree of willful ignorance by some collectors eager to add to their collections. Worse still is their lack of knowledge about the history of what they already own. Some don't want to know. Who can be against infusing the opaque system of the art world with increased transparency? Tax cheats? Those who possess stolen works of art? Smugglers? Terrorism networks? Because privacy alone cannot be an argument for doing nothing when the stakes for the common good are so high. In closing, the policy of the Western Allies and the work of the Monuments Men established the high bar for the protection of cultural treasures during times of conflict. It was a source of pride for General Eisenhower, who said, "It is our privilege to pass on to the coming centuries treasures of past ages." What then will be our legacy?
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel. I first of all want to say hello to my good friend, a fellow Texan, Mr. Edsel, and state to all here that you are a Texas treasure. We appreciate you. Now, Mr. Edsel, I was glad to see that the Monuments Men received the Congressional Medal for their contributions in protecting artifacts during World War II last year. Your contribution cannot be understated, and personally I felt like it was long overdue, and I was proud to support that effort. My first question is, you have said that a major benefit of the Monuments Men effort was that non-combatants in Europe were grateful to Allied forces not only for liberating them, but for preserving the cultural history of the continent. Would you elaborate on that, and do you believe the same would be true if we were better able to save antiques and other cultural objects in the Middle East today?
Thank you for your kind remarks, and thank you for you and all of your colleagues for the support of the legislation to award the Monuments Men with the Congressional Gold Medal. It was quite a moment. Yes, I believe that the United States would be looked upon favorably by nations of goodwill throughout the world, and I think the evidence is irrefutable, because look at what happened in 2003 in the aftermath of the American-led invasion of Iraq. Not getting into the issue of whether we should or shouldn't have been there, but it raises the issue of what is the responsibility of the United States or any force when they're in a foreign country concerning the protection of cultural assets. And our failure to plan and take care of those assets caused enormous damage to the country's reputation around the world. I know from experience in interviewing Monuments Men, during World War II, there was a great deal of skepticism because so much of the damage that took place in Europe was a result of Allied bombing and artillery to soften up landing beaches. But time and time again, the people expressed appreciation for the fact that you had to get rid of the bad guys, you had to get troops on the ground. And when they saw efforts to effect temporary repairs and then at the end of the war, in a break with civilization, return some of the 4 million objects, 4 million, that these 100 or 200 men and women without any technology, no computers, managed to get back to the countries from which they were taken. So I think there's no question, yes.
Are we doing enough as a nation, I think you've kind of touched on this, to safeguard the cultural heritage in these regions of the world, and what more can we do?
Well, this is a great question, and it's a challenge of our time. Look, it makes no sense for us to be sending modern-day Monuments Men, people with Blue Shield and Patty's organization, which are doing great work, into harm's way without force protection. It worked in World War II because we had 3 million troops in Europe. But to say that because we can't put troops on the ground, we can't do anything is ridiculous. The United States is a leader in technology, and we're not using all the tools necessary to try and put an end to a lot of these things. We've discussed, and there have been some good questions here of the panel about steps that can be taken going forward. There are two realities about collectors that are inarguable. They love to show people what they've got. That's a problem if it's hot. They hate losing money. That's a problem if you demonetize illegally owned works of art. And I'm not talking just about objects that come from these war zones, but going back to Nazi-looted art. Works of art that were stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum from Mr. Lynch's part of the world. Objects that are stolen from churches in Italy, all over the world. These things don't get stolen unless there's someone to buy them. They don't get stored in these tax-free zones unless someone thinks eventually the spotlight's going to move away and there'll be collectors that can buy them. So if we have some process to register works of art, perhaps there should be a threshold there where there's a clean bill of sale. You have this, your things, your work of art, whatever it is, a small object, a painting is known. There's no chance there's no concern about it being something that was smuggled. It's going to be a disincentive for people out there with lots of money to be out there buying these things, knowing that, where is your piece of paper? I don't want to buy this thing unless it's been cleared. Is it a huge challenge for us from a technology standpoint? Sure, it's work. But 100 to 200 monuments officers in the face of a war that claims 65 million lives, with no tools of technology, found and returned 5 million objects. So I'm not really interested in hearing someone tell me all the difficulties or why something can't be done today when we can read a credit card from space. So the technology's there, the question is the will there. And in the process of addressing the diminution or termination of the sale of looted antiquities, and in this kind of increased reporting, bring transparency, because who's against transparency? If we bring that into the arena, we're not only going to be cutting down on trafficking and sources for organized crime, for ISIS and other terrorist organizations, but the Internal Revenue Service is going to be getting more of the revenue that it's due, which is going to take a burden off of taxpayers that are having to carry the share of people that are trying to duck the system. It's going to return works of art to the places from which they were stolen. There's no downside to doing this. It's just a matter of the will.
Gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the ranking member for your work on this important topic. And Mr. Edsel, I was at the ceremony for the Congressional Gold Medal, and it was touching. It was great to see some of the remaining monuments men and their families there, and it was really touching. I want to start out and talk about motivation here. And isn't ISIS or other motivations in the destruction and marketing of these cultural items really an issue of trying to establish cultural superiority? Isn't that what drives people when they do this sometimes? If you look back at your experience in looking at Europe in World War II, didn't Hitler want to demonstrate cultural superiority and capturing all this art and having it and possessing it?
Yes, it is a significant factor. There is no question that if you look over the 20th century, and we do a little bit of study of history here, the genocides that end up happening, the Holocaust during World War II, Jews weren't incarcerated and murdered immediately because there's a key component of the theft and destruction of these objects, and that's the process of humiliation. We're going to detain you. We're going to put you in concentration camps. But while you're alive, we're going to steal the things and destroy the things which define you as a civilization. And yeah, we're going to kill you later on, but we're not going to do it yet. And we saw this in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We've seen this in Mali, the destruction in Timbuktu of Islamic treasures by people that are purporting to be followers of Islam. But these are treasured relics that defined that civilization, and the process begins by destroying them. And now we have, it's not really a modern twist. I think when you look back over Nazi Germany, if you want to talk about institutionalizing the looting, the Nazis wrote the book on it. The amount of resources that were dedicated in an organized way, troops, trucks, planes, trains, to move around all of the cultural treasures of Western civilization, from butterfly collections to the church bells in the cathedrals, to paintings, to drawings, to statues, was extraordinary and a distraction to the war. Okay, ISIS may not have quite those resources at this point in time or that degree of organization, but there's a strong incentive for them to do it, and I think certainly the things that are immovable are at great risk of being destroyed. We saw that in Palmyra and bombing on Buddhas with Al-Qaeda in 2001. We see it now evolving to things that can be sold. Why destroy them when we can sell them and convert them to cash?
Yeah, I think this is a cultural genocide, just like we're experiencing religious and human genocide in the Middle East, and it's a great tragedy, and it's one that I think our administration has been behind the curve on now for multiple years, and others in Europe and Russia as well.
Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Lynch. Thanks for your leadership on this important hearing. There's nothing that, to me, is more disgraceful about what these terrorist organizations are doing than what we're hearing about here today. The International Council of Museums describes the situation as the largest scale mass destruction of cultural heritage since the Second World War. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization Director considers the Islamic State's destruction of cultural heritage sites in Iraq and Syria to be an international war crime. The Global Financial Integrity Group conservatively averaged and aggregated existing figures to estimate that the value of the illicit trade of cultural property may range between $3.4 and $6.3 billion annually. And so, Mr. Edsel, my question to you, and following up Mr. Hill's line of questioning, in reading the statistics about the individual Islamic State looters, one estimate is that the looters themselves, the Islamic State fighters who are actually pillaging these historical and cultural antiquity sites, really they're only taking about 1% off the top, and that most of the profits from this illicit trade of antiquities is coming to inure to the benefit of the middlemen who are engaged in this. So my question is, I mean, obviously this is some source of revenue for the Islamic State, but is it more a matter of wiping out the cultural and religious artifacts that are inconsistent with the twisted ideology of these terrorist organizations? Are they equal motives, or is one predominant?
I'm sure it's a slippery slope trying to be an analyst for ISIS and what's going on inside their head. I think what we can say is that if we can find a way to disincent by eliminating or reducing the revenue-making opportunities of stealing these things, we at least are cutting down on one of the main reasons that it's happening. Now, there's little we can do about addressing the ideological motivations for stealing or destroying things. Again, I emphasize, I have people all the time say, well, why don't we have monuments men, or why don't we have Blue Shield people there? It would be a suicide mission to send the troops into harm's way without having force protection. But the world's changed, as Monuments man Mason Hammond pointed out, and we have all sorts of weapons, non-military weapons, that we are not using, that are, I should say, are evolving. This use of aerial photography to see developments on the ground, as Patty talked about, and others are really pioneering the use of 3D technology to do imagery of these non-movable objects so that if they're damaged or destroyed, they can be rebuilt. People are thinking about these things now. This is a positive step.
Gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, very much. I appreciate it. Thank you all very much for being here. Mr. Edsel, let me ask you, if I may, sir. As more and more pressure is put on ISIS, hopefully, from the Western world to stop this horrible pillaging of our human history, do you think there will be different avenues that these folks will use to loot and to sell the antiquities?
Different than what they're doing now?
Yes. Can you look down the road and extrapolate for us here, as more pressure is put on the combatants in this part of the world, what their reaction will be when it comes to funding their terrorist activities using this source of funding?
Well, if we're successful in Syria and Iraq, I think I agree with Patty. I mean, our focus shouldn't be on what to do now, because we already ceded that opportunity away once ISIS gained control of these areas. To ask what we should do about Palmyra, that's the wrong question. What we should be doing is thinking about what are we going to do about where they're going next, whether it's Libya or some other area. They will go, they will take this same type operation. If there's oil revenue, I mean, I was in the oil and gas exploration business 15 years. That's a simple, fungible, immediately profitable way to generate revenue. But that doesn't mean that because it's the majority of revenue that may go to ISIS, that we shouldn't be concerned about these cultural treasures, in particular for this reason. We're 5% of the people in the world in the United States. We're trying to figure out how to get along with 95% of the people in the world. The currency that connects people around the world are cultural treasures, sports, music, works of art. We don't necessarily look at the world that way here. It's not wrong. We're just a much younger country. But if we want to curry favor and do ambassadorial work in building up the esteem of the United States in the eyes of the world, showing respect for cultural treasures of other countries, which is the hallmark policy of President Roosevelt and General Eisenhower during World War II, will do more than all of the foreign aid we're giving away, in my opinion.
Do you think that ISIS, as it spreads its ideology, for example, now over to Libya, and they're becoming much more active there, have you seen this same sort of illicit activity in that part of the Middle East?
Not a question I am qualified to answer. You want to talk about the world going around. The areas that are of concern in Libya are the very areas that the very first monuments men started work in 1943 in North Africa, in Leptis Magnum and other areas. So we're right back to where we began some 70 years ago.
Mr. Edsel, do you think that purchasers of this artwork, this antiquities, these pieces in America, are they aware? Let me rephrase that, sir. Do you know of illicit artifacts having been purchased by Americans?
Of illicit artifacts, not necessarily from this area, yes. From the area that we're talking about in a contemporary sense of antiquities, I don't have any personal knowledge, no.
Mr. Pittenger is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for being with us today. We have 5 minutes here on my part, and I would really like to get your action points. What you would do if you were in our seat. What policy changes, legislation, you've mentioned some, what work with our international community, what would you do to prevent the utilization of antiquities in the market and plundering them and the use by ISIS? Mr. Edsel, please begin. I'll give each of you a little less than a minute.
We need more transparency. I think Mr. Schindell's comments about establishing standards for disclosure are absolutely correct. There's something horribly wrong from my perspective as a citizen coming back into the country with requirements to declare any cash or fungible currency, $10,000 or less, and yet we can ship works of art around the world out of the eye of the system. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area. I certainly think the art looting group at the FBI, Customs, ICE, needs more funding. They've got a very, very difficult situation. But we've got to get people that are collecting to understand there's a responsibility on their part to know what these objects are and where they came from, and that there's a consequence to willful ignorance.